I came into this thinking it'd be just another job. Could you imagine? Folks in my line of work aim to give them what we call the good death. Every person I go to see is already marked. Some cling on to hope. Those are the hardest ones. But ma'am, truth is, by the time I show up at your door, there ain't no hope left. Can I tell you a secret? I know how you're probably gonna die when the time comes. People tend to think death is like in the movies. Clutch your chest, whisper something profound, and drop to the floor. But honey, that ain't how the story ends. More often than not, it starts with you getting sick, same as always. Next thing you know, you're in a hospital bed, doctors and nurses coming and going. They'll rattle off some number, saturations at 86%, aorta measures 5.4 centimeters, renal function down to 10%. There'll be talk of treatment plans and medications, but sooner or later, someone in a white coat's gonna tell you there's no getting better this time. Whether it takes days or months, that bed becomes the last piece of this world you'll get acquainted with. That's when I in the beginning. It used to tear me right up. I'd sit in my car and cry my eyes out every time they told me my services weren't needed no more. But there's only so many tears a person can shed before the well runs dry. At least that's what I thought. Then came Mrs. Jackson. That woman? She found a way to break my heart worse than any man ever could. Her mind was mostly gone when I met her. In those moments, she'd tell me stories or make me promise to keep an eye on her grandkids after she was gone. Sometimes, I think, a good conversation can ease the soul more than any drug we've got. It's never too late, she'd say, over and over. Picked that up in some counseling session. Mrs. Jackson grew up in 1950s New Orleans, all jazz and heat and possibility. Her daddy played trumpet for a local band. Right up until he passed when she was 15, she kept that trumpet all these years, sitting in its case in the corner of her room like some kind of shrine. Swore up and down she was going to learn to play it someday, just like her daddy. But life has a way of slipping by when you're not looking, doesn't it? Her dying wish was for me to teach her how to play that trumpet. But Lord, her hands. They were swollen and twisted like gnarled tree roots from arthritis. One thing this job teaches you quick is that hoping for the impossible only breeds more pain. And honey, in this case, there wasn't a lick of hope to be found. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. In my head, I was furious. You mean to tell me you let that trumpet collect dust for near 70 years, and now you want me to be the one to tell you there's no sense in that no more? But I bit my tongue. Instead, I just kept putting it off, promising we'd get to it next visit. And there I went, crying in my car again, just when I thought I'd run dry. Hospice care ain't just about morphine drips and bedpans. It's the families that really keep you on your toes. Death's got a way of peeling back the layers of a culture, showing you what's really underneath. I've seen families so quiet you'd think the Grim Reaper had already swept through, leaving nothing but shadows behind. Then there's rooms so packed with wailing relatives you'd swear the Pope himself was about to go. Back in nursing school, they drilled it into our heads that we weren't just there for the patients, but for the families too. Turns out, that might be the only thing they got right. My company even offers a full year of bereavement services after the fact. My whole career, I've had people telling me to keep my professional and personal lives separate. Don't get too involved, they'd say. I'd bet my last dollar that whoever came up with that line never spent a day in hospice care. When you're holding someone's hand as they take their last breath, or explaining to a child why grandma isn't waking up, you gotta be a pretty cold-hearted son of a bitch not to hold them close and cry along with them. Life has a funny way of tangling you up in other people's stories. These days, I find myself getting invitations to quinceañeras for girls who were still in diapers when I first met their families. I've sat through more disappointing will readings than I care to count, and I've snuck more than a few women out to shelters when divorces turned ugly. Sometimes, I look around and realize I've got myself about 24 adopted families. Those people, they need me. And if I'm being honest, I need them too. Funny how I can be there for strangers when I couldn't manage to do right by my own flesh and blood. People going through loss, they're like ships without anchors. They latch onto anything that seems stable, and more often than not, that ends up being me. I reckon it's because I'm the only one who looks like they know what they're doing. Most of the time, what they really need is someone to tell them it's okay to hurt, to cry when they need to, and then to get back to living. They don't always want to hear it, especially from some stern old white lady like me, but it tends to help in the long run. I knew in my bones this would be one of my last visits to Mrs. Jackson. That's how it always goes. Her faded yellow shotgun house came into view at the end of the driveway, all rutted earth and broken boards. The place sagged like it was carrying the weight of 100 Louisiana summers, paint peeling off in long strips, boards warped and graying. It was the kind of house that had seen better days, but couldn't quite remember when my hand was on the rusted doorknob when I heard it. A sound so unexpected it stopped me cold, the low, mournful cry of a trumpet drifting out from the back of the house. It was soft as a whispered prayer, but it filled the air around me, wrapping me up in notes that spoke of joy and heartbreak and everything in between. It was the kind of music that could only come from someone who'd really lived, you know? Someone who'd seen the world and let it carve its story into their soul. I found myself moving through the house like I was walking on eggshells, afraid that one wrong step might shatter whatever spell was being woven by that trumpet. The floorboards creaked under my feet, but the music played on. It pulled at something deep inside me, something I thought had long since dried up and blown away. When my fingers finally brushed against Mrs. Jackson's bedroom door, the last note faded away, leaving nothing but a heavy silence in its wake. I eased the door open, and my heart skipped a beat. Mrs. Jackson lay still as stone in her bed, the monitor beside her singing its flat, final note. In the corner, a man I'd never laid eyes on sat with the trumpet cradled in his lap like a sleeping child. My body moved on autopilot. All those years of training kicking in, I rushed to Mrs. Jackson's side, fingers searching for a pulse that wasn't there. My penlight flicked across her eyes, finding pupils fixed and dilated. Nothing. She was gone. I turned to the stranger. "Sir, are you family? Can you tell me what happened?" "Flew away just moments ago," he said, his voice soft as falling ash. "Been wanting to play for her one last time." The protocol I'd followed 100 times before sprang to my lips. "Can you please wait in the living room? I need to contact her doctor and next of kin." I paused, curiosity getting the better of me. "How did you say you knew Mrs. Jackson?" His eyes, dark and deep as river water, met mine. "Why don't you sit for a moment? She ain't going nowhere." I felt my smile strain at the edges, frustration bubbling up inside me. "Sir," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "there are guidelines I have to follow." "I understand. But in my experience, the most important conversations happen when we set our watches aside. Why don't you pull up a chair? I've got a feeling you might want to hear what I have to say." Asterisk, 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 I hesitated. Everything in me said to leave, to follow protocol, to do my job. But something in the man's eyes held me there, like a moth drawn to a porch light on a summer night. "Just a moment," I heard myself say. "I can spare a moment." His smile widened, and he gestured to the worn armchair beside Mrs. Jackson's bed. As I sank into it, the springs creaking in protest, he lifted the trumpet to his chest, cradling it like a child. I leaned forward, my professional detachment crumbling. "You were close to Mrs. Jackson then?" His fingers caressed the trumpet's valves, a ghost of a melody in the air. "Close? Shoot. I've loved that girl since before she was even a whisper." His eyes softened, a fondness and something else I couldn't quite place. "Loved her mama something fierce too." A lump formed in my throat. "You're her." "I remember the first time she heard me play," he continued. "Couldn't have been more than a few months old. Her mama said she'd never settle. But the moment I picked up this horn, little Sally went quiet as a church mouse." "Sally?" I asked, the unfamiliar name catching me off guard. A shadow passed over his face. "Ah, that's right. Margaret. That's what they call her now, isn't it? But she'll always be my Sally." I nodded slowly. She told me her father was a musician. He lifted the trumpet, letting it catch the dim light. "This here? This was supposed to be hers one day. Had such plans, such dreams for my darling." I frowned, thinking of the tarnished trumpet gathering dust in the corner of Mrs. Jackson's room. "But she never learned to play." "No," he said, his voice heavy. "No, she didn't. Life has a way of stepping in, doesn't it? Of taking the song right out of your heart." He looked at me then, his eyes dark with an emotion I couldn't name. "You ever wonder why that is? Why we let the music die?" "No," I said softly. "She talked about you sometimes. What happened to you?" His smile turned bitter. "I had to go away. Didn't want to, mind you, but sometimes a man doesn't get a choice." He ran a hand over the trumpet's bell. "By the time I came back, well, seems like Sally had forgotten how to listen. Or maybe she just didn't want to hear no more." Asterisk, 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 I opened my mouth to respond, but the words never came. Mrs. Jackson's body suddenly convulsed, her back arching off the bed like she'd been struck by lightning. The vital monitors erupted into a frenzy of beeps and flashing lights. I'd seen patients come back before, but never like this. Never with such violence. "Lord, no. Please." The scream tore from her throat. "Get away from me." Mrs. Jackson's eyes, wild and terrified, darted around the room before fixing on the man with the trumpet. The look of sheer horror on her face made my blood run cold. "You," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not? You can't be." I spun around, but the chair where the man had been sitting was empty. Only the trumpet remained, gleaming dully in the low light. In that moment, I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. Mrs. Jackson's ragged breathing snapped me back to reality. I moved to her side, my training taking over. "Mrs. Jackson," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, "I'm here. You're okay." She gripped the sheets, her knuckles white. Her words came out in a jumble of half-formed pleas and fragments of prayer. I held her hand, murmuring reassurances, as the second hand on the wall clock ticked by with agonizing slowness. Gradually, her breathing evened out, her grip on the sheets loosening. When I reached for the phone to call the doctor, I noticed my hands were shaking. I took a deep breath, willing my voice to remain professional. As I reported Mrs. Jackson's condition, I omitted any mention of the visitor. Some things, I've learned, are better left unsaid. Dr. Simmons arrived before the hour was up, looking like he'd stepped straight out of a Faulkner novel, all rumpled seersucker and eyes that had seen too much. He listened to my account, his brow furrowed deeper than the creases in his weathered face. "Lord have mercy," he muttered, shaking his head as he examined Mrs. Jackson. His hands moved with the surety of a man who danced with death more times than he cared to count. Tachycardia, high blood pressure, pupils dilated like she's seen a ghost. He straightened up, tugging at his collar. "Looks to be a panic attack, brought on by the morphine most like. We'll adjust her meds, see if that don't settle her some." After the doctor left, I once again sank into the chair by Mrs. Jackson's bed, feeling every one of my years. The house creaked and settled around me, full of whispers I couldn't quite make out. My eyes kept drifting to that trumpet, lying there innocent as you please. It gleamed in the low light, like it was alive, waiting. The floorboards groaned, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. A young man stood in the doorway, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Couldn't have been more than 25, with Mrs. Jackson's high cheekbones and eyes deep as wells. "You must be Tommy," I said, standing up. My knees popped like firecrackers. "I'm Alice, your grandma's hospice nurse." He nodded, his eyes darting between me and Mrs. Jackson like a spooked animal. "How's she faring?" "Resting easy now," I assured him. "Had a rough patch earlier, but the doctors set her right." Tommy inched to the bedside, his hand hovering over Mrs. Jackson's like he was afraid she might crumble to dust if he touched her. This was the grandson Mrs. Jackson had fretted over, the one she'd made me swear to look after. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I sat with Tommy in the front parlor, trying to explain what was coming. The room was filled with faded memories and unspoken words. "When people reach this stage," I said quietly, "the body starts to give out. Heart problems become more frequent." I explained what to expect and what a DNR order meant. Tommy just nodded, his eyes distant. "I've seen that look before, someone struggling to process difficult news, or perhaps just wanting to be somewhere else. It's not my place to judge which it is. Sometimes people just get lost in the fog of emotions. All I can do is offer them a blinking light to help guide them out." I asked gently, "Were you and your grandma close?" He shrugged. "We were before she got sick. Haven't seen much of her lately." I sighed. "Well, Tommy, she's ill. She can't do what she used to." "That's not my fault," he said. "Ain't sure what that's got to do with me." "She still loves you," I said. "You know, hearing is often the last thing to go. Even if she can't respond, she might be able to hear you. Why don't you talk to her?" Tommy stood up, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't have anything new to say to her. Look, I have plans." He headed for the door. "Thanks for taking care of her, but I need to go." I wanted to respect his need for space, but something compelled me to ask, "Tommy, before you go, what do you know about your great-grandfather?" He paused in the doorway. "Not much." "Why? Do you have a picture of him?" I asked, aware I was overstepping. He gave me a puzzled look. "Why do you want to know?" I hesitated. Mrs. Jackson mentioned seeing him. I thought a photo might comfort her. Tommy gestured toward the mantel. "See for yourself. He's second from the left." I picked up the frame, wiping off a layer of dust. For men in suits looked back at me from another time. The one Tommy indicated was short, with a wide smile and distinctive cheekbones, clearly a family trait. But he wasn't the man I'd seen in Mrs. Jackson's room. That man was standing right next to him in the photo. I turned to ask Tommy more, but he was already gone. The screen door banged shut, leaving me alone with my questions and the lingering feeling that something wasn't quite right.